70% of this country is born after 1991. You have no idea what it was like. It's madness.
What happened then in 1991 was that Narasimha Rao he was a politician. Politicians are different from dictators. Politicians reach out and make compromises. We don't have politicians today in that sense. He reached out and built consensus across political parties, which made the reforms palatable. Each of them could then go out and sell it to their constituents. Today, that's not going to happen. Opposition means opposing. It means nothing more. It's profoundly anti-intellectual. So we're living in a very anti-intellectual phase right now.
And so many young people have lost the memories of what happened after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed and all that. So socialism has again become a nice feel-good word, and they haven't dug deeply enough to understand what it truly implies and how it took or destroyed the lives of hundreds of millions of people.
I am just completely amazed by the energy, the enthusiasm, and the positivity of young people today. And I was just telling someone this night before last, which is that, when I moved out of the corporate sector and got into entrepreneurship, the layer of people with whom I interacted and became partners or collaborated was really thin. It was really, really thin. Over the last 10 years, working with startup entrepreneurs, and I've invested in over 60, 70 companies. I have discovered India through their eyes,
It's people with these luxury beliefs whose lives are now fine, who are living good lives, who are sipping wine, the champagne liberals, single malt progressives, who can afford to have beliefs that claim to speak for the poor but actually hurt them. It's like Indira Gandhi saying Garibi Hatao and actually keeping hundreds of millions of people in poverty for decades longer than they otherwise would have.
Hi everyone, this time we have Mohit Satyanand and Amit Varma joining us on Growth is Good. Let's dive right in. Guys, so we have this very small tradition, since we only have 17 or so episodes, of asking people what is their personal connection to economic growth. How did you even figure out that there is such a thing as economic growth? How do you connect to it in your daily life, your history? What's your personal connection to it?
So mine starts with the famous Hindu rate of growth, which was coined in, I think, Delhi School of Economics, roughly before I studied economics. And it seemed like a grave insult to me that we should condemn ourselves to it. But it seems like we were condemned to it till 91. And one thought that one had crossed a significant barrier. And I think there's nothing like economic growth, because otherwise you get caught in this very divisive war of how to cut the pie rather than how to grow the pie. And so I love pie, and I would love to see pies grow. So the cake story is very much there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sugar is poison, so you got to be careful of what's in the pie. But rather than my connection to economic growth, I'd say it's my connection to individual freedom. That's where it comes from. Like, one of the great dissonances of our times is that there is one set of ideological beliefs which believes as if two consenting adults can do whatever they want with each other in the bedroom, but not in the marketplace. And the other side believes exactly the opposite. And that's just crazy to me, because just at a purely principled level, I'm a believer in individual freedom. So that's part one, that I kind of came to it via that, and I came to it late. There's this saying, if you're not a communist at 18, you don't have a heart. If you are a communist at 30, you don't have a brain. So when I was in college, I was carrying around Marx and reading Das Kapital and all, which also sounds Bengali, by the way, Das Kapital, and I'm Bengali. But over time, I got mugged by reality, looked at the world around me, questioned all the dogmas, and figured out that no, what really matters to me as a value is individual freedom. So I am not at all dogmatic about the facts. The world is deeply complex. You're always finding out new things and questioning your priors, but I am very dogmatic about the values. And individual freedom is the be-all and end-all for me. And over time, I have realized that all empirical evidence points to the power of economic growth. I did a great episode on my podcast with Land Pritchett. He's got this incredible paper. I think the title is Economic Growth is
Enough and only growth.
Only growth is enough. It's both necessary and sufficient. And he looked at human welfare indicators from health to whatever, the whole gamut of human welfare indicators, and found a 99% correlation between that and per capita GDP, which of course comes from economic growth, and less than 1% with things like redistribution, welfareism, etc. So that's kind of been the futile fight of my life, because what happens is we've been hardwired from prehistoric times for good reasons with bad instincts, and those bad instincts are a belief in the zero-sumness of the world and that top-down thinking works. And the great truths that have transformed my life is understanding positive sum thinking and also understanding the power of spontaneous order and the respect for complexity it gave me. So I'm very much a devotee of economic growth, but before that for individual freedom, because that
And it sounds like it was a gradual accumulation of many things and not any particular defining stories.
it's a gradual accumulation that happened through probably my mid to late 20s and then through my 30s. And for me, the two big intellectual turning points were, one, understanding economic freedom, which is really spontaneous order and positive sum thinking. And
How did you understand it? What got you there?
what got me there was thinking about the world, looking at the world around me, because we were going through the 1990s, and I was a son of an IAS officer, and he was firmly in the the state socialism camp and all that. But you look at the world unfold around you in the 1990s, and we- you can't help but be mugged by reality if you're
That's
an
what got me
independent
there.
thinker. You can see.
Yeah, so I want to go back because I was in Delhi School of Economics in the mid-70s, and before that in DU, and the obsession with slicing the pie was so strong, but there was a supposed theoretical background to it, and uh, this Marxian theory. I mean, I realized I was being mugged because it took away human agency. And I said, this is completely divorced from who we are. We may be compassionate, but we are individualists. And this is just taking that out of the equation. So it's based on a false conception of who we are. We are not angels. This assumes that we are angels, and therefore we are not repulsed by the fact that our concerns have got to be with our neighbor and so on. Those must be the aspect of free choice. So I found that I was dealing with this huge superstructure of theoretical economics, which was based on a completely false understanding of who we are as human beings. So I got mugged a lot, a lot
Which
before.
is
No,
amazing to
and
me.
I'll just double click on that to complete my previous sentence. The two things that changed me was, of course, understanding this aspect, and the other was understanding human nature with a deep dive into natural selection and all of that. And and the moment you understand human nature, you understand why these theories can't work, because E.O. Wilson, the biologist, has a great quote about communism where he says, "Great idea, wrong species." Right, and he postulated that is perfect for ants, but it cannot work for human beings, which is absolutely true. Ants don't need agency. Human beings.
Interestingly, ants have a lot of agency. Ants actually perform very similarly to human beings. They're just individual coordinating and optimizing on pheromones, right?
Well, let's just say the instincts and the priorities are different. So,
So, ironically, for me, it was like, we are not angels. So, ants and angels, they both begin with the same two letters. Ants and angels, it would make a nice episode, actually.
ants and angels. That's a nice title. I don't know what we talk about.
Anyway.
Evolutionary biology can be it. So, Mohit, I find it super interesting that going to the Delhi School of Economics is what turned you, because it was the den of socialism, right? And it's kind of like the Thomas Sowell thing. He studied economics under Milton Friedman. That didn't convince him, but working for the government for a year turned him into a libertarian. And it's amazing that studying socialism for 2 years is what did it
For
for you.
3 years
So
before
3
that.
and 2 further.
in DU,
So my favorite thing about you, and I think I may or may not have told you this, is that you are responsible for Crax, which I don't know if you know, but it was a massive part of my childhood, right? Like, it was the thing that you looked forward to because it was the more expensive version of Fun Flips, so it wasn't as easily available. And many decades later, I come around and meet this man and he tells me he was the one who set up Crax. What was it like setting up a business before 1991?
So you took this structure for granted, You didn't... it was revolting because here you were someone with an idea, and you had to literally prostrate yourself before people who, I have to say, I do suffer from some amount of intellectual snobbery, and so you had to prostrate yourself before people who knew nothing about anything in order to get various licenses and so on. And I'll give you one example of this. So at that point in time, this was long before we even had what was called OGL, Open General License. We had a body called DGTD, the Directorate General of Technical Development. And you had to prove to them that the machinery that you were installing, whether imported or not, the machinery that you were installing was the most appropriate for the activity that you intended to conduct. Now, Crax used something called extrusion technology, okay? Which is basically you put this corn and you, under very high pressure and temperature, you extrude it and it puffs, hence corn puffs. Now, there was no extrusion technology in India, okay? The responsible technical officer, he must have had some designation, director or whatever it is, was a generalist. I don't even think he had a BTech, okay? He was a generalist, must have been recruited by writing some exam. He was actually a pretty nice guy. But he had no idea what this extrusion technology was, right? I was also a generalist, certainly not a technician, but I'd spent a year and a half understanding various stack production technologies, honing in on this, and I must have visited 10 or 12 factories around the world. Singapore, France, Germany, Italy, various parts of the US, to decide that this is the machinery I wanted. Now, I have to persuade the DGTD that this is the appropriate machinery for
He
this.
probably wants a world tour also.
No. So, he was very frank. He said, see, I don't know anything about this machinery, right? I have to prepare a note. It has to go on the file. You please write that note for me. So I then had to spend 5 or 6 days cyclostyling. In those days, there was no photocopying. Cyclostyling various technical literature and write-ups from the machinery manufacturer to explain why this was the most suitable technology for this. And I submitted to him. There was this look of relief when he went through it because it seemed like a really good case. He could, in all honesty, say, yes, this is the appropriate machine, move it up the file. I thought this was really well done. Now, any organization in those days, provided it was a little bit more than a mom and pop trading shop, had to have a liaison officer because otherwise there was no way that you could operate in this world. And so the liaison officer then went to follow up to make sure that the file moved up and so on and so forth, moved down. And about 2-3 weeks later, he was now responsible for coordinating with this gentleman. And about 2-3 weeks later, he said, I think the file is coming back now. It's gone up and it's coming back and it's all green and so on and so forth to go and make sure that we get the license. And one day he called me on the intercom and said, I think it's going to arrive today. I'm going to meet Mr. X. And he came back and he was angry when he came back. I said, what happened, Kapoor Saab? He said, I got the license. I said, why are you looking so angry? He said, the amount that he asked for was even more than I thought he would. So there were 2 parts to it. One was the complete intellectual vacuity of the process. You were teaching somebody about extrusion technology who had no desire to learn anything about, and was not qualified to vet it. And second is that after all this effort, you were paying a person over and above paying him through your taxes.
Which was the important part anyway, right? Everything else was performative.
Right.
So your illustrious namesake, the world's second best Ahluwalia, Montec has a story in his book about how in the early 1980s, Infosys applied for a license to get this machine that they wanted. For the purpose of the story, let's say it was a 2 MB machine which went at whatever, a certain speed. And it took them a year and they got the license with the number of the
I
thing
remember
and
the
all of
story.
that. And as soon as that happened, after a year's process, there became a cheaper machine available, which is 3 MB instead of 2 MB, and which is 1.2x the speed. So it's better and cheaper. But they couldn't get it under this license. They had to apply for another freaking license to get it. So, 70% of this country is born after 1991. You have no idea what it was like. It's madness.
And thanks for that segue, because in some way we are returning to that world, right? And perhaps it's because 70% of the country was born after 1991. I don't know.
That's giving it a social license. But I must say that while it's true that we are seeing a lot more interference and we've been seeing the creeping up of tariffs and so on and so forth, we are a long way from that world.
Absolutely.
I don't want to minimize the change that happened. That same organization, we sold the Crax business. My friend's son has now set up a business that makes packaged cakes and so on and so forth. At least at that end, the processes are infinitely smoother and so on. The Inspector Raj continues, but licensing by and large is gone.
No. I think in terms of magnitude, I completely agree with you. It's the direction that worries me, and not just in India. I think a little bit in the world, right? I think earlier you made this very interesting statement. What was it? One party cares that consenting adults can do what they want in the bedroom, but not in the market, and the other is the opposite. That's not really true anymore of the Republican Party in the US. Right?
No,
the consenting adults in the market
see,
is
no,
also doesn't
actually,
seem
to put a correction there, that's a theoretical construct. Actually, both parties don't want consenting adults to do anything anywhere.
anywhere.
That's where we've reached, right? They're all enemies of freedom. I'll make 2 points about why there seems to be a return to that kind of thinking. One, of course, you're absolutely right that, 3 points therefore. One, you're absolutely right that, so many young people have lost the memories of what happened after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed and all that. So socialism has again become a nice feel-good word, and they haven't dug deeply enough to understand what it truly implies and how it took or destroyed the lives of hundreds of millions of people. That's part one. Part two, very quickly, is that, as I alluded to earlier, we are hardwired with beliefs about the world that are wrong, because when when our instincts formed in prehistoric times, you're living in a small tribe, it's natural to think in zero-sum ways, it's natural to think in top-down ways. Those are wrong. Now, because our intuitions are the way that they are, the fight for liberty requires, as Jefferson put it, eternal vigilance. So it's a permanent fight. You're never going to actually win it once and for all, because human nature won't change. The third point is that in countries that are better off or that are prospering, you have a category of beliefs that I call luxury beliefs. These are beliefs that are actually held mainly by the rich for the purposes of virtue signaling and feeling good about themselves, and they don't really care about what happens to the poor. For example, I was at a conference in DC last year where Azhar Nafizi, who wrote Reading Lolita in Tehran, she made a great point about Iran. She said that in Iran, the people who fight for freedom, the dissidents over there, they really fucking care for freedom. And their issues are all the basic issues about individual agency, autonomy, liberty, etc., because it's an existential threat for them. But American liberals, if you look at them, care about a bunch of beliefs that seem bizarre, and they have the luxury of doing that because they're no longer fighting the existential battles, right? You look at someone like Zoran Mamdani, for example, who won the Democratic primary and socialism is on the upswing. Look at the people who voted for him.
Yeah.
They're all freaking rich and privileged people. Below a certain income level, the people he claims to be speaking for, the poor, they all voted for his opponents in the Democratic Party, not for him. It's people with these luxury beliefs whose lives are now fine, who are living good lives, who are sipping wine, the champagne liberals, single malt progressives, who can afford to have beliefs that claim to speak for the poor but actually hurt them. It's like Indira Gandhi saying Garibi Hatao and actually keeping hundreds of millions of people in poverty for decades longer than they otherwise would have.
So I want to make 2 points, Amit, in response to what you said. One is about the hardwiring. I think the additional factor living in tribes and so on and so forth was that was a time when technology was not making a difference to lives. And today, when technology can make a difference to lives, then freedom is much, much more important, because it's only freedom. And as far as I'm concerned, while of course I share Amit's view as far as individual freedom and liberty coming first, but if you look at economics, I think the march of economic progress is actually the march of technology. And the march of technology requires economic freedom. I want to make one second point, which is
I want to stress on that though,
Yeah.
Mohit, right? Like what you said, that the march of technology requires economic freedom. It's not that technology is more beneficial when there is economic freedom. Of course there is. But it's economic freedom that gives birth to technology in the first place.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
So just want to
but
stress
all I was,
that.
Yeah, absolutely. All I was saying is that if you don't have technological progress, then economic growth is also very, very restricted. The second point I want to make, what he was talking about, champagne socialism or single malt progressives, is that
My phrase.
to some extent, uh, a lot of the virtues of socialism came from very specific societies, which are the Nordic countries. And what people lose sight of is that these countries became rich long before they became socialist, number one. Number two, the social conditions over there, very small, very small population, huge ethnic homogeneity, and so that sense of identification with your neighbor. So in those very specific conditions, you can say if you're rich and you want to give your money away or share it with your neighbors, that's your prerogative. Just like I can be a capitalist, but also be an altruist. That's my personal.
And a couple of points to add to that. One is Johann Norberg, of course, has many books about the Nordic countries and how they became rich before they became socialist. But then if you look at the definition of socialism, they didn't actually become socialist. They redistributed a little bit, the high taxes, welfareism, but they were also very easy to start a business there, and the economic freedoms were there. So that's a whole different.
And in
Exactly.
spite of all this, they still ran into trouble.
Yes.
Sweden in the 90s was the sick man of Europe, right? So they ran into a lot of trouble. They had to reform substantially and become more market oriented to survive in spite of all of this.
No, they were always market oriented. The specific thing that they had to do was at a point in time, taxes became so high that the incentive to work vanished, and they actually had to pull taxes
Yes.
back. That was a specific.
And include requirements to work in their welfare. So they used to cut off welfare after 2 years. They had to introduce all of these things. So in spite of all this, the Nordic countries didn't make it work. Yeah. So, I mean, freedom is on the downswing. Socialism is on the upswing. What keeps you optimistic in your nihilistic optimism?
Yeah, so first of all, look, well, I'm optimistic in the sense that the world is going to hell. We are all going to die. Nothing has meaning. So, like, hey, anything goes. Enjoy life. There's this. I'll give a family-friendly version of what Kashinath Singh wrote in Kashika. See, bhar mein jaye duniya, hum bajaye harmonia. So that's my personal philosophy. But seriously, what actually makes me optimistic is technology. I think technology, while technology can enable state oppression with surveillance and etc., technology, I think, empowers individuals much more than any liberal political movement ever did, and it can also reduce the role of nation states in our lives. Like in every field, whether it's media, entertainment, whatever, as I often say that the mainstream is crumbling. Similarly, I think even when it comes to geopolitics and all that, the mainstream is crumbling in the sense that, of course, nation states exist and they will exist and they are much stronger than they used to be. But their penumbra around my life is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Most of my life, in a sense, is if I'm online, if I'm chatting with friends around the world, dealing with friends around the world, is outside the purview of the nation state. Less and less am I constrained and shaped by geography. So I view technology as something that can be an enabling force, and the future is always unknown unknowns, and you hope that some of them work out well. But at the same time, there is certainly a backlash on freedoms all across the world. Sometimes you look
Except
at 25% tariff, 50% tariff. It's like a computer simulation gone wrong. I mean, I have to pinch myself. What's happening?
Well, hopefully this shall pass, but I want to add to what he's saying, which is that technological progress in India, I mean, we're not forerunners in anything, and there's been a lot of cynicism about the startup universe. But having spent the last 10 years working with startups, I think there are two things to it. The first is that the spirit of entrepreneurship in India has got unleashed. You cannot put it back in the bottle even if you want to. I don't think anybody wants to. States want power, and hence you require this constant battle, which is the vigilance upon by those who don't want to give up their freedom. But also, a lot of what young people are doing today in entrepreneurship is moving so fast that the state ability to control them is lagging far behind. They become like the crooks, and the government is like the police, except they're not crooks. They're furthering the boundaries of economic progress, and they're moving really, really rapidly. So you're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. The other, and I think this is in some ways even more important, is that we're sitting in a new paradigm of the funding of entrepreneurship. Much more than technology, what I'm seeing is the way in which entrepreneurship is getting funded. You talked about Crax. Now, without putting too much of myself into it, the fact is that at that point in time, we're not talking about that long ago, I'm talking about 1984. I had the idea. I was a guy who ran around and, got the machinery going, etc., etc., etc. The people who funded me had the liaison officer who went and got the... but I had no equity. Today, I would own 80% of that equity, because the accumulation of capital was so primitive over there that it was concentrated in a very, very few hands. And that inhibited entrepreneurship. Today, that capital that is funding these entrepreneurs is both local and global and decentralized, does not belong to institutions, and it has created so much fluidity. Today, a guy like me who can write a 5 or 10 or 20 lakh check, 100 of us may get together and fund somebody. So the mechanisms to make that happen have happened. So the movement has been enormous. It's only going to mushroom, unless somebody really is so stupid and self-destructive that they come back and stop that.
like Trump. So, but this is optimism, but it's optimism coming from very much that we shall escape politics, not that politics can be better or more controlled, right?
I'm afraid it is, because, when I was much younger, I was like, Desh badal denge. I used to think that, okay, politics is downstream of culture. So I used to, lecture all my policy advocacy friends, think tank people, that you're focusing on the supply end of the political marketplace, but the supply will respond to demand. First, we got to change the culture. It's a 100-year battle, etc., etc. And I thought, karenge? But as time passes, I think you get we've both been tempered around the optimism of that particular part, that, maybe society will change in the ways that we would like to see it change. Maybe it won't, but it very much seems as if it is a truly uphill battle, and we will continue fighting because that is all we can do. But, that's not where I get the optimism from.
But so then, and I'm a little bit a votary of the politics is downstream of culture school of thought. Ultimately, the enduring phases of human welfare, which have been only the last 200 or so years, have sprung from this cultural and political arrangement that we found in the West, which was restraint on political power. Right? Magna Carta, the US Constitution, and that gave us 200 years of entrepreneurship, technology.
I want to push back. I want to say, first of all, the Magna Carta was a movement of the elites entirely. It was one bunch of elites against the king. The constitution was circumstantial. Like Subhashish Badra has a great book, Kesh Tiger, where he points out, and it's a great point, that if you look at the different constitutions of the different countries, they were shaped by circumstance. For example, when the Indian constitution happened, the country was falling apart. You didn't know if the center would hold. The lines on the map didn't exist. So therefore, centralized power and so on and so forth, and all the economic fashions of the day, etc., etc. The US Constitution happened at that unique time where you could have a constitution that sort of embodied freedom, but it wasn't really, it was more, the respect for individual freedom was more in the culture there than anywhere else, but it was still a movement of the elites. You look at the 91 reforms, completely a movement of the elites.
Correct.
When Narasimha Rao tried to sell the reforms, like Gurcharan Das calls it reforms by stealth. Right. So if you remember one of Manmohan's early speeches, each paragraph talks about a reform, but each paragraph begins with a quote by Nehru or Indira, where he is sort of paying obeisance to them and pretending that, hey, this comes from our ideas only. Narasimha Rao at one point said that we are just making socialism work better. They were actually scared to say that socialism has destroyed us and we are going towards freedom and we are going to embrace markets. So you had all of this other BS going on. So I would argue that the reforms happened, bunch of elites, certain circumstances, etc., etc. We were very lucky. It was a perfect storm. We had 20 years which went really well, and then everything went to hell. But what I always say is that those bureaucrats and those politicians, because it went across parties, from Narasimha Rao and Manmohan and Chidambaram to Vajpayee, Jaswant Singh, Yashwant Sinha, and then Manmohan Chidambaram back again. We had a lucky period where you had statesmen who cared about what was good for the country, and you had a cadre of bureaucrats who were reform minded. But I think of them as outliers. Look at the politics today. Look at the policy ecosystem today, and I would say it was never part of the culture here. It simply wasn't. That is a battle we failed to even begin to fight.
So I want to amplify on that a little bit and perhaps have a slightly different point of view. One is, of course, to underline the fact that we all know, but I think needs to be underlined, which was that irrespective of the fact that you had a cadre who had already thought about reform, the fact is that that reform may not have happened if we hadn't hit rock bottom, if we didn't have to take gold from India to the vaults of the Bank of England as the most obvious and visual symptom of the collapse. And so you actually have people talking today in not very loud voices that maybe what is happening with Trump's tariffs and so on gives us occasion, there's another crisis and let's have it. At this point in time, I don't think we have the cadre of bureaucrats who can put pen to paper and draft legislation which can actually bring about substantial reform. I think the second point about what happened then in 1991 was that Narasimha Rao had he was a politician. Politicians are different from dictators. Politicians reach out and make compromises. We don't have politicians today in that sense. He reached out and built consensus across political parties, which made the reforms palatable. Each of them could then go out and sell it to their constituents. Today, that's not going to happen. Opposition means opposing. It means nothing more. It's profoundly anti-intellectual. So we're living in a very anti-intellectual phase right now.
And again, this is not just limited to India, right? Like very, very similar trends across the world. And is it again the technology aspect playing into it? Is social media bringing us back to the below that number? What's the number? The 150 people number where you care about the gossip and the Dunbar number, right? Like,
I don't think so, Rahul. The way I see it in a very simplistic way is that the pace of progress in the last 25, 30 years or whatever has been extremely rapid, of both technological and economic progress. And societies are not hardwired for such rapid change. And when you have such rapid change, you have significant portions of society within a nation or nations within the larger society of the world who get affected. And Nobody likes change of that magnitude, especially when they are the ones who are left behind.
No, but
And
yeah, sorry.
yeah, and so I think that if you look at the U.S., that's clear that, you have the entire manufacturing belt who got, in a sense, left behind. The fact that they were actually better off because they could import cheaper Chinese goods and so on is a different matter. But their progress was not as rapid as what was happening in Wall Street and in the Silicon Valley. And then you have predators. You have politicians who are predators who are able to not just feed upon but also amplify that sense of loss. And uh, Europe, to some extent, the same, except that they'd already shot themselves in the foot by being overly
Several
legislated, and
decades ago,
therefore
yeah.
progress was very, very limited. In India, I would say that it was not so much technological and economic process as the rapidity of social change. I think that the fact that, I know I'm jumping, but the fact that suddenly you had cups talking about holding people back was not because nothing had changed, but because suddenly women were going out in the world and they were losing their hold over it. So these are just 2 or 3 examples of the rate of progress, both economic and social, being too rapid for people to digest. And then that creates the circumstance and the necessary condition for people to come in and say, we will look after you.
So I want to dig a little deeper and add some nuances to that, and I'll make three kind of points. One is, and this played out in different ways to different extents. One is what Timur Kuran in his 1999 book Private Truths, Public Lies referred to as preference falsification, right? And the example he gave then was that during the Soviet Union, everybody thought that everybody supports the regime because nobody spoke out. And then you had what he called a preference cascade, that once you saw other people speaking out, you realized that, other people oppose the regime, and then they all joined in. And that early preference falsification vanished, and you had a preference cascade. And I think a similar thing happened in India where, for example, part of Modi's rise is because the closet bigotry could now come out of the closet. You could express yourself. If you had anti-Muslim or anti-woman sentiments or whatever, it was now suddenly respectable to say things which otherwise you would keep to yourself and assume that only you had. And in different ways, these preference cascades across the world cater to our worst instincts. And this is an indictment, therefore, of society itself. The second point is that what social media has done is created an incentive to cater to the extremes, right? The moderate, nuanced voice does not get traction on social media, will not get retweets, will not get wawa. The more extreme you are, the more you will get retweets from your folks, the more you will get applause. So if you look at the incentives, you go on social media, you find an ideological tribe where you're comfortable, and the more extreme your utterances, the more likely you are to go viral and to get their applause. And this typically happens where you are never engaging with arguments because that requires complexity and nuance, but instead you're attacking people on the other side, and you're attacking people on your own side for not being pure enough. What this creates is a vocal minority that's very loud and a silent majority that completely shuts up, right? This is the second aspect. And the third aspect is that what social media also does is that it makes it easy to propel simple narratives forward. I look at what happened in 2016 and think that one of the key reasons for Trump's win, and he wasn't smart enough to have planned this in advance, it just happened to work for him, is that he had simple narratives that were false but that beautifully explained to people why they were suffering. For example, the workers of the Midwest who have lost jobs and are going down. He
Yeah,
sold them
completely false
he
narratives.
sold them
Yeah.
two simple narratives that were both false. And one is that your jobs are being shipped overseas, so therefore anti-free trade and anti-China and etc., etc. And the other was that immigrants are coming and taking your jobs, and therefore Mexicans are rapists and all of that nonsense. Now, they're both false. But to give that nuanced narrative that, look, in the long run, it's great, this is fine, it's okay, you're getting cheap imports, blah, blah, blah. It's very hard to sell a complex narrative when social media depends on 140 characters or 280 characters and simplicity works. So I think these three things, particularly the drive to extremes, has decimated political parties because the Republican Party went to one extreme, the Democratic Party went to another extreme, and they've been decimated and hollowed out. And that brings me to a disillusionment I think we would all share, that we realize that the world is less principled and more tribal than we would have imagined. That people who claim to speak for a set of ABC principles or XYZ principles actually only espouse those principles because it makes them part of a tribe. And if the tribe moves away from those principles, so will they. We've seen that happen with the Republican Party. We've seen that happen with so many of the people here who thought Modi will bring about free markets and supported him for that reason, and stayed with him even when it was obvious that is more of the same plus cow. So
Worse, actually. So I just want to emphasize what you were saying, which is that in a sense, politicians have always required to be simplistic because they're speaking to very, very large numbers of people, many of whom may not have had the privilege of the kind of education and reading and thought and so on that the two of you have. And social media makes that so much easier because the amplification that they receive is so huge. And in a sense, this suits them hugely because intellectuals always ask difficult questions. And now they don't need to answer them any longer because they have the millions on social media.
In the same world, we have Javier Milei, who is a popular leader who is pro-freedom, right? Is that just because Argentina is so badly screwed over the last 100
To my
years?
earlier point,
Like
which is
1991.
you
Is
need
that,
a crisis.
is that all that's
how much
happening?
lower could Argentina go?
Go.
They were already in deep shit, and Javier Milei is a delightful outlier. I'm watching him with keen interest because one thing that I've seen is that even in the past, like the logic of the state insidiously leads to the state getting bigger and bigger and accumulating more and more power. And even freedom-minded reformers of the past, like Thatcher and Reagan, could not change that. The state only grew bigger against both of them. Thatcher did make some good reforms, but it only grew bigger. It's a terrible beast to fight. So I'm watching Milei with keen interest because he actually has cut down the size of the state drastically. It actually is working. So nobody can say, look, he's destroyed the country. And I think we're all watching it with keen interest because maybe there's a model there for us to aspire to.
Yeah. And interestingly, I think in absolute terms, we are way worse off than Argentina is, right? So,
Yeah, except we don't realize it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I just want to make one point over there, which is, lest I sound like a proponent of economic crisis, because you have all, you have all of Africa, which is an economic crisis, but they don't have a Javier Milei. But I think as far as India is concerned, I think the difference between India and Argentina, and to me this is actually a very important point, which is that Argentina at one point in time was one of the richest countries in the world. So they've seen that in the recent past, if not within generational memory, certainly within family memory. You know, my father, my grandfather, my uncle, and Buenos Aires was considered one of the world capitals and so on and so forth. We don't have that. We don't have that memory. We have memories of the partition. We have memories of famines. We have memories in my lifetime, forget generation. We have memories in my lifetime of having 2 days a week where you didn't have cereal because our food productivity was so low, and of our subsisting on grains coming from the US, which Lyndon Johnson used as a political tool. We actually said we're living from ship to mouth, and this was a reality. So therefore, for us, this is a golden age because we are much better off than we were, and at least nobody has to worry about starvation because Modi is ensuring that every home gets grain. And I will say this as somebody who spends a lot of time in a relatively poor part of the country and is embedded in the local society, not a visitor who parachutes and been there for almost 4 decades. And the people we associate with are the local villagers, is that the expectations from progress and from life are still very, very basic. They're still very, very minimal. So that aspect of anger that fuels a lot of Latin America, for example, that immediate restoration of what existed just a generation ago, we don't have that. We're moving, and whether that movement is 8% or 6% or 4%, which I actually think, it's still progress. And we're seeing that progress every year.
I think Indians have never been citizens. We have only been subjects. So that mindset is baked in. And we are apathetic about what the government can do for us. I mean, what is democracy in India? Is rival mafias fighting for the monopoly of violence, right? And that's something that we've kind of internalized. So I think when people vote for a particular political party, it's like cheering for your football club. It's a tribal act. It's like, yay, Manchester City, and yay, I'll vote for this party or that party or whatever, based on whatever reason. There's no actual expectation that something will happen. And if there is an expectation, it's like, I want to get my caste guy as my MP, so then I can also get some goodies. And that's about it. That better governance, we don't think about that. We don't expect that.
No, and governance is as empowerment. I don't think that conception exists. The point is that you are at the very, very basic stage of expectation. The fact that you're now getting free grain is enormous. I can't tell you how enormous it is in rural areas.
So that's surprising to me, right? Like I think the free grain promise has been around for a long time. By 2011-12, the percentage of people that were dependent on free grain was already 15-20% or so. So why is that such a big deal?
Good question. I think it's two things. I think firstly, it's a token and a very substantial and perceptible token. So I don't mean token in the sense of it being trivial, or trivial. It's a very substantial token of the fact that my baap cares for you. And secondly, and this is actually, I think, quite destructive and insidious in the longer run, what it's done is that young people who were perhaps promised implicitly a better future if they went to school, studied well, etc., but that future is not materializing in terms of jobs and so on and so forth, in some senses, and as I said, they're very perverse, is liberating them from the need to work. Because at least they are not eating the product of their father or their mother's labor that is coming to them from the government. So it's actually also profoundly perverse. And marginal farmers have stopped farming, at least in the mountains, because so that's the negative aspect of it. But from the political point of view, it's seen as being a demonstration of the big-heartedness of our leaders.
So it's better for the soul to be there. How will it be on?
I really think that number one, it can only be won through culture, as both you and I have agreed. It is not going to be won by policy advocacy groups going to the government and saying, ye karo, it's good for the people. No, it's not going to be one like that. It has
You're destroying his job, Amit.
Yeah.
That's what he's doing.
Exactly. No, I'm giving him purpose. It will only come from the culture. And also you're using India in a collective sense. You know, Margaret Thatcher, I think, once said that, don't speak to me of society, it's only individuals. So when you say that India, you know, I'm not sure that collective term, it's so nebulous, but I think, you know, you can do, I mean, individuals can be empowered by technology, by and by a lot of conditions that don't exist around us, like the free movement of labor and capital, and all of us can just fight the good fight and try to make things better in that regard.
For me, it's entrepreneurship, Rahul. It's entrepreneurship because, as I said, that genie is out of the bottle. I am just completely amazed by the energy, the enthusiasm, and the positivity of young people today. And I was just telling someone this night before last, which is that, you know, when I moved out of the corporate sector and got into entrepreneurship, the layer of people with whom I interacted and became partners or collaborated was really thin. It was really, really thin. Over the last 10 years, working with startup entrepreneurs, and, you know, I've invested in over 60, 70 companies. I have discovered India through their eyes, you know. I'm working with young people who were born in Tundla and Dhanbad and suburbs of Pune and literally every state in this country. And were not born into privilege in any way, whether in terms of material or even in terms of education. And each one of them propels 10 others. So that genie is not going out of the bottle. And just as you have had, and I don't want to dwell too much on it, just as we have had, in a sense, economic policy and very specific micro policies which are being tailor-made to the specific interests of large industrialists and lobbies. I think that these young people and the businesses that they set up and the scale and the speed at which they grow, because capital is not coming from institutions which are controlled by government, but from purely autonomous agencies, you and these young people, or could be writing checks for these people. I think that is creating a huge amount of change, and each of these people will create their own lobbies and put pressure. And at some point in time, because they are so diverse, because none of them, except the odd person, is threatening, to use the old phrase, Birla Tata, therefore, the government will, in a sense, be forced to acknowledge the positive energy that these people bring about. The fact that government is not going to generate jobs. It is these people who are going to generate jobs. And to my mind, that is the biggest weight on the government right now, is its ability to generate employment. So I think that the government will be forced, except in certain sectors where they're defending very deeply entrenched industries and families, they will be forced to allow this entrepreneurism to flourish, and they are the ones who would create the change.
I'm going to add to that and say that my hope really is from the young people from small towns. You know, I feel that our elites deserve the contempt they get from the equally contemptuous populists, right? There's nothing that's going to happen there. So if you're an English-speaking elite and you're born in a city and even worse, if you've got a degree from a foreign university, you have nothing to contribute to the country. Change will happen from young people in small towns. That is where the fire will come from. That is where there is that existential urge to improve their lives. And that is where luxury beliefs can't thrive.
This is exactly the point that I'm making. You know, the Tundlas, and
Yeah.
I want to leave you with one story, okay, which is this young man I met. I may have some of the details a little bit wrong, but this young man I met went to school in a small town in eastern UP. I think it was Gorakhpur, but I'm not sure. His father was unemployed. His grandfather was supporting him through school. And after the 10th, where he did quite well, he dropped out because his grandfather died and there was no one to support him. He left home and set up not a tea stall, but he set up a chana-stall on a railway platform which actually existed. Okay, and within a year and a half, he had 2 of them, and he started making some amount of money, enough to send some money home and certainly to support himself. His father got a job and said, "Now you come back and go to school." So he went back to school, did his 11th and 12th in an ordinary government school, came first in the district. Based on coming first in the district, he got admission into Delhi Technical University. And I think he got a job after that. 1 or 2 of his classmates appeared for the IIM exams, and one of them got into, I think, FMS or Delhi. And he said, "Main bhi karta hu." He wrote the exams, and he had like a 99 percentile in the math, but he actually got a negative in the English because there's negative marking. So he went back to this chap and said, "How do I improve my English?" The guy said, "Okay, I'll help you." Obviously, innate intellectual abilities were so high that the next year he got into IIM Lucknow. Got into IIM Lucknow, came out, got a job with a large company. I think it was an MNC. And after a couple of years, very successful years, his supervisor said, "Now we need to sit down and plan your career progression." And he said, "Before you go any further, let me tell you that I have no intentions of continuing in a multinational. I want to set up my own business, and I have a very clear idea of what it is. I want to create a supply chain for people who run stalls in railway stations and markets." And his supervisor said, "Here's your first check." And I've had the fortune of writing a second or a third or whatever it is check for this young man. He is so bright. He is so focused. He understands the operating conditions of those vendors. There are 50 of them in Atta Market in Noida, for example. He knows what they're thinking. And today, in the last 6 months, he's raised another 50 odd crores. And now, to take off from what Amit was saying, there's been some amount of, you must have seen it, there's been some amount of conversation in the pink press about people saying that, the sons of our business families don't want to run business any longer. They only want to write checks, as though that's a bad thing. I think it speaks to two things. One is they don't have the same energy as these young. So I'm only amplifying what Amit said. But the other is, I think it's a great thing, because they are then dealing with these young people, and there's such an incredible amount of cross-fertilization going on, because they can bring the structure of large organizations, the way to plan, etc., and keep putting money in. And the young people who come from these small towns, who have fire in their belly, they understand the people they're serving. They don't need market research to do it, because they know those people. So this boat is not coming back to the harbor, and this boat is going to become a flotilla, and the flotilla is going to become a fleet. I'm extremely despondent about our policy thinkers and about our politics and so on. But this, engaging with these young people for the last 10 years, it's a privilege of a lifetime.
See, you're feeling hopeful now, aren't you now? Yeah? Are you happy?
After that conversation, to be having a happy note is amazing, right?
Yeah. You can do it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for calling us. Pleasure.